Hello, Martin Wade, and welcome to the Scribe Craft podcast. Uh,
Hello.
Great to have you, for myself and the audience, to speak to you. So, to start off, then, could you just tell us a bit about your background, how you kind of came into kind of like journalism and writing, and how that's pivoted into your works so far, and then we'll explore the actual works in question in more detail.
Okay, I've been in journalism, broadly speaking, for over 25 years, originally with the South Wales Argus, a daily paper in Newport in South East Wales. I was a feature writer, digital editor there for many years. I've also been a media operations officer in the Royal Air Force for just over nearly 11 years now. There's a good crossover there. That sort of explains a lot of my areas of interest, I suppose, in terms of military history and politics. I also studied international politics. Seemed a long time ago, about 35 years ago, when I went to University of Wales in Aberystwyth. I now work as a civil servant, as a Welsh Government press officer, poacher term gamekeeper, if you will. And my most recent work, I suppose, has been publication of two books, with one coming out next year. The first book, which was published last year, was the first published history of my squadron, number 614 County Glamorgan Squadron, the Royal Auxiliary Air Force, which was a long cherished ambition, really, to put that history out there. And it's very good to put it out for the 100th anniversary of the Auxiliary Air Force in 2024. And a couple of weeks ago, my second book was published on the actions of the Auxiliary Air Force in the Battle of Britain. Another sort of untold story, really, where a third of the kills in the Battle of Britain were obtained by pilots of the Auxiliary Air Force. So it's very much my passion is telling the story of the part-time element of the Royal Air Force, which I'm proud to be a member of.
Okay, excellent. Can we, because this podcast is as much about the craft of
Mm-hmm.
writing, hence the title. And so before we could do a deeper dive, I say, into your actual book projects, can you just take us back into your journalism training, kind of back in the day,
Okay.
um, how you were instructed to do that, your journalistic experiences, and how you feel journalism has changed in the quarter odd century it's been since you actually started?
Right. Okay. Well, I suppose my training was spread over different sort of areas. In that, the core of my training was through, as it is for most journalists, through the NCTJ, which is the National Council of Training for Journalism, and I completed my qualifications there in around sort of 2004. So that takes in things like news writing, media law, court reporting, that kind of thing. But the big thing I think I learned there is about knowing your audience and writing for your audience. So being very clear about what their level of knowledge is, and not talking down to them, not talking up to them, but trying to establish exactly where they are and delivering something they'd be interested in, and really latching onto that idea that it's very easy to write how you want to write, but there's quite a paradox about writing, that you're not writing for you, you're writing for your audience. And if you can always keep that in mind, that was a thing that news writing, the sort of basic skills of it, that essential principles, just always be mindful of who they are. You picture almost in your mind about what section of society you're writing for, what knowledge they may have, and generally what they're interested in. And that was hugely important. And that would be drilled into not just in the training, but day to day on the news desk. If you were either pitching stories yourself, or you're looking at stories that later on, when I worked as a news editor, that your antennae would be quivering when you saw sort of something that was not pitched very well and not written with an audience in mind. You'd know that, well, who's going to be interested in this? And that always is the bottom line about who's going to be interested in this, who's going to give a toss about this. And you've got to think about the subject matter you're covering, think about how you're covering it, and think about how you're writing it all the time, really. Because otherwise you're shouting into the wind, really.
And how would you say, what elements of that skill set and experience did you take and adapt it towards your, not pivot necessarily, but your side hustle, so to speak, as a military historian or Air Force historian in the context of the books you've written?
Yeah, it's a good question because I have had to sort of reposition that slightly. The essential principles are the same in that whether it's 180 character tweet, a 300-word news story, or a 70,000-word book, you're still thinking about, am I pitching this at a very well-informed, slightly niche audience or a bigger audience, a mass audience? And my instinct always, both in my professional life, with my civilian life and Royal Air Force media operations head on, is that you want the maximum number of people to be aware of this. You want to tell the story to as many people as possible. So in that sense, the principle has been the same about not diving down rabbit holes of technical detail necessarily, but bringing out the human experience and the human story, making that the lead element of the narrative. So driving the human story is the main selling point, if you will, but then having that bolstered by technical detail and sort of the factual element, but making sure that you're clear about what drives this story and keeping that as the center of the narrative to make it a compelling and interesting account, really. And that those sorts of things I think are they're important to just keep a good balance between, because it's possible to write stories, write history that is quite dry and quite technical, but you end up really preaching to the choir a lot of the time. I'm not sure how much, if my goal is to inform people in this country and beyond about the role of reservists in the Second World War, I want that story to be understood by as many people as possible. And if you go down a route of telling a very dry technical story, you're probably not going to touch many of those people who are sort of mildly interested, but possibly not likely to engage with that narrative. So that's my instinct, is try to tell the story to as wide an audience as possible.
And so you mentioned you're a media operations reservist officer.
Mm-hmm.
Before we go on to really discussing your first book, what prompted you to basically join the Royal Auxiliary Air Force?
I suppose I'd had an ambition, as many do, to join the Air Force when I was young, as a teenager. As a pilot, that seemed a very fantastic thing to aim for. On discovery that my maths wasn't that great, certainly wasn't up to the standard of people I knew who were joining as pilots when they were doing degrees in physics and electrical engineering. I went down a different path. I went down the journalism path. But seeing when I saw adverts for media operations, as particularly focusing on recruiting people from civilian careers based in media and getting them to do a job of work for the Royal Air Force, a light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, well, I could do this, and that was sort of 13, 14 years ago, when the ball started rolling, and a couple of years later, I found myself swearing my allegiance and joining the Royal Air Force Reserves. And it's been a fascinating journey, a distinctive journey, but a lot of those principles about communications hold true in that context as they do in a civilian context as well.
So your first book was called On Dragon's Wings,
Yeah,
and that is a history of 614 Squadron, County of Glamorgan.
yeah.
Can you just take us through the process of what kind of gave you the idea, the inspiration to write the book in the first place? The process in terms of the writing it, the amount of research you had to do, as you say, the adaptations you had to make personally and professionally to write multiple tens of thousands word book as opposed to, as you say, a tweet or a news article. And what were the overall lessons you took away from your first attempt at that kind of military history narrative?
Okay. I suppose the inspiration was being part of that squadron for a start, and knowing a little about the history when I joined, and finding out fragments as I, went through in my early career with the squadron. I was clear, I was open about my history and my interest in history, military history, with the squadron leadership, and was made squadron historian in 2017. So I was just the focal point for gathering any stories, any contact with veterans families at that time, really more than veterans themselves. And I had the kernel of an idea, an aspiration to write the history. I knew that other squadrons, other Royal Auxiliary Air Force squadrons, had their histories written in the past sort of 30 or 40 years, and some very distinguished histories they were of squadrons like 601, County of London, highly decorated Battle of Britain pilots, etc. 614 seemed to be an outlier in that we didn't have a published history. And I really set that as a goal quite early on, that I wanted to right that wrong, really, and to tell these untold stories. Because as I was gathering this picture of an incredibly diverse range of tasks and theatres that we operated in as a squadron, and so much of it was just unknown. I mean, and a lot of this is which bugs me slightly about Royal Air Force history. I say that having just written a book about the Battle of Britain, but people know about the Battle of Britain, they know about the Dam Busters, they know about D-Day, but anything beyond that, for instance, Operation Torch, landings in North Africa in 1942, big episode for our squadron, barely talked about, really. The operations the other side of the desert in El Alamein, well known, but it wasn't part of that. Really, they just don't register much, and it was the real determination to tell that story, and further to tell the story. We were the only Pathfinder squadron operating outside of the UK from the Royal Air Force in the Second World War. Very little recognition of that. And part of the problem is that there was no single place where this information was held, i.e. a squadron history. And no one had gathered all that testimony, those reports, that information, the accounts together in one place, which is what I was determined to do. And that was, well, God, that was 2017, 2018. So the trawling process was quite extended and quite broad. And also just, I had to focus and work out exactly how you do move from writing 300 word, 1500 word pieces to writing something much bigger, in the range of, well, it ended up being 200,000 words, so which had to be cut down hugely by the publisher, by myself, when I was told that it wouldn't be possible to publish a book that big. But it shows the difference in scale of the project, the kind of project that I took on. But I think, as I said before, the principles were the same. I had to keep focus on who my audience is, what kind of knowledge I'm pitching it to. And I wanted to make it a general history for the general reader who is interested in military history, but again, just be very wary about plunging down rabbit holes about, again, talking about technical capabilities of the engines of a Halifax bomber, for instance. I was determined to have a sense of that, have illustrations of it, but keep it within a human context and tell a human story first, because that is what propels people's interest, is harnessing everything because these are stories of people. They are stories, of course, of campaigns and of politics and of advances on the battlefield, but at their very centre, they're stories, very human-centered stories. So that was an element of the transition between short-form writing and journalism to writing books. One really big element, I would say, though, in just formulating the idea in your head about writing a book, is a big thing which changed for me was the step between just randomly gathering accounts, information, whatever I could find, to focusing the structure of the book, and to, even just in a very basic way, to creating folders which are called what the chapters would be called. And within those chapters, division in my mind of what the episodes would be, and I'm making that so in the structure. So when I'm gathering, I'm filing things in the way that I'll tell the story. So a thing which struck me from some of the photographers I used to work with at the South Wales Argus were trained in the old film photography ways. So they would go out with a camera with a film which you could take 36 shots on, a long way away from the digital camera we have today, where you can take endless numbers of pictures. So they had to be very careful with what they took a picture of, and they had to use the expression they used was they edited in their head. Okay, so even before they were taking the picture, they were thinking and editing about what they were going to use. So it became apparent, and I think this is what happens when you have when you are just gathering information. There's a real risk of just over gathering and being quite unfocused about what you need, what you're going to need to tell that story. And if you can be quite sharp with that, you can save yourself quite a lot of wasted effort if by being diverted down rabbit holes and just being diverted away from the core story that you want to tell. Because just as digital photography allows us to take countless numbers of images, the internet and the connectivity of lots of bases of knowledge allow us to just gather endlessly, and that can be a blessing and it can be a curse as well.
And you spoke of the importance of relaying stories
Yeah.
of people. Is there a particular story or set of stories which really stood out to you, left their mark on you during your research process that you can tell us about?
Yes, absolutely. There was a couple, one in particular. There's a chapter in the first book about members of our squadron of prisoners of war. And some in particular took part in towards the end of the war. The Germans forced the members of the incarcerated prisoners in camps in what's now Poland to march westwards as the Russians were advancing from the east. And so they were marched across Germany in the depths of winter in January 1945 at minus 25 degrees, little food, terrible conditions. And an account of one of those by a wireless operator from 614 Squadron was just staggering. It was written in such a moving, simple way. He was a man called was Flight Sergeant Sid Barlow from Wigan in northwest England, and it was written with quite an authentic voice. Sadly, I didn't get to meet him. He died before the squadron was reformed, but he'd sent some letters to the Squadron Association, and it was just a beautiful, moving account of the kindness that the POWs showed to each other, which enabled them to survive that ordeal, but also the people that the German civilians who saved lives and fed people on the way, which wasn't what I was expecting at all, but just an incredible account of human resilience and survival in the most difficult circumstances. That was profoundly moving, and I was very happy to include it in the book. But as often happens, I couldn't include as much as I wanted to in the book, because it's important to tell the broader story within that within that chapter of the different experiences of the POWs. And his was just one of those experiences, but a very important one. So yeah, that was a very striking account.
You spoke of the editing process in terms of there was so much you had to leave out, and versus what you could leave in, just to keep the book manageable. In terms of that editing process, though, were you basically your own editor? Who did you work with? Did you have any? Was it an internal process in your head in terms of I really want to keep this in, but as an experienced journalist, I know that I need to sacrifice this? Or did you have any back and forths with another editor or various other people from the outside who said, I know you like this, Martin, but no, sorry, you need to leave this out, and so forth? Can you just tell us about that process, whether it be internal or external wrestling with what you could leave in and leave out?
With both books, actually, it was mostly an internal process with, in terms of, I had to really cut the book down to about 100,000 words. So that was a process really that I had to weigh up, mostly myself, about how much of the story do I want to tell. And again, it was going back to first principles of going through it. And one interesting technique, which might be useful, is if you can start any paragraph or section with, interestingly, da 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 da, at the same time, da 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 da, generally you can leave that out, because that's not contributing to the central story you're trying to tell. If you're saying, oh, by the way, this was happening, interestingly, da 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 da, generally you can leave that out. But for what I'm often attracted to are those sort of by the way stories, which help illustrate your central story. But when you have to be quite ruthless and quite brutal, you need to just cut those out, sadly. George Orwell talked about, as a writer I admire, not just for his content, but the thoughts that he had on writing style. But he talked about parasites in writing. Is this contributing to the overall narrative? If it isn't, cut it out, because it's effectively it's wasted words. And if words are precious, if you've got a limit and you've got to get to it, you've got to be just focused on that 100% and just cut. And sadly, a lot of those things which you thought were fantastic elements of the story end up on the cutting floor, which is the lot of any creative process, really.
So that book was published to great acclaim, I believe. And what lessons did you take from writing that first book, to take into writing the follow-up? And then can you tell us about the follow-up, please, your follow-up book, in terms of what it is, what it's about, and the process involved in composing that one?
Okay, so I suppose a big lesson I took to the second book is that be very wary of that wasted effort in terms of those by the way and those interestingly elements. Just be very focused on what's the story I'm trying to tell here, and check all the way through the process. Am I still telling this story? And if you're not, stop and say, what's this element that I've gathered here? Does it contribute to the story? Does it contribute to the narrative that I'm trying to put together? And it was a much more rigorous sense of that than I applied in the first book. I think for the first book, it was more in retrospect, having produced this enormous, sprawling, far too big book, really, far too big work, which then needed hacking back to try and do that from the ground up, really, to do that editing in my head from the start as much as possible. Because I suppose I knew or if I had a better feeling of what the end product would be. So I was much more focused in what I was allowing through my sort of editorial process, if that makes sense. And that was, yeah, a big difference, I think.
And so what was your follow-up work then?
So the follow-up book is the second book is called Volunteer Aces of Churchill's Few. So this looks at the subtitle is the part-time pilots who helped win the Battle of Britain. So the part-time pilots and their auxiliary squadrons. So these are the members of the Auxiliary Air Force and the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve, the two main part-time elements of the Royal Air Force before the war, who went on to become some of the highest scoring fighter pilots of the Battle of Britain. So it's a way of shining a light on the contribution of part-timers in squadrons like my own to eventual victory in the Battle of Britain. And although I mentioned the Battle of Britain is a well-known story, the elements that I wanted to focus on was an untold or lesser-known part of that, which was the contribution of these former part-timers. So these people who, like we do now, serve, 25 days a year, 2 weeks annual camp every year, and do their training in their spare time alongside their civilian jobs. And then when war came, they were mobilised and brought into the full-time Royal Air Force and made a staggering contribution. I mean, 30% of the kills in the Battle of Britain were from pilots in auxiliary squadrons. So they really punched above their weight. So 14 out of the 60 squadrons in the Battle of Britain were auxiliary squadrons. And they had in the top 10 squadrons in terms of numbers of kills, there were sort of 4 or 5 of them, off the top of my head, were auxiliary squadrons. So they punched above their weight massively. And I wanted to tell that story because no one has ever done that in that focused way before.
So on that note, then you said you wanted to tell some of the untold stories. Are there any particular, similar to my previous question for your first book, are there any particular stories that stood out to you, but that you feel actually need to have their awareness of them raised more?
It was a slightly different perspective, I suppose. Some of the stories were quite well known within the auxiliary squadrons themselves, but no one had ever really. What my objective was to tell a familiar story from a different angle. So some of these stories, some of these people were well known. So, for instance, John Dundas, he was a fighter pilot with 609 Squadron. He was a journalist himself before the war, but he went on to destroy 10 German aircraft during the Battle of Britain, and was awarded the DFC as well. So his story was known up to a point, but not hugely well known. And I wanted to make him the focus, one of the standout characters of the book, and also tell it from the perspective of the fact that where his career started. So it didn't start as someone going to Cranwell with a full-time role in the Royal Air Force. It started in this way of straddling two different worlds. So working as a journalist, in fact, covering the Munich crisis. So he travelled to Europe, covered a lot of the talks between Chamberlain and Hitler and Mussolini. So he had a fascinating sort of civilian career before or alongside his Royal Air Force career. And what I wanted to do was bring that out and bring that to people's attention, really, to tell that story alongside the story of his Royal Air Force career in the Battle of Britain. So it was that sense of, yeah, telling a familiar story from a different angle this time. That was the focus.
And were there any new lessons that you took away from your second effort?
Um, yes, I think just in formulating the ideas, the core sort of focus of the book. I think it's worth just sense checking with as many people as possible. Um, just keeping it's quite difficult because you know you don't want to the number of people you can just give a 70,000 word manuscript and say, have a look at this and see what you think of this are quite few. But it's always worth just not restricting the thoughts around a book just to yourself and just to socialize the idea a bit, you know, and just to, in the way that you would with any project, sort of check understanding, I suppose. And that's useful.
So, what's the next project for you?
Well, the next one is another book about the Auxiliary Air Force. So this one is focusing on the many firsts of auxiliary squadrons in the Second World War. So the first RAF squadron to operate jets, the first squadron to operate airborne radar, first attack on a U-boat with airborne radar, and some of these sort of heroic episodes they were involved in. So again, some of these are kind of little known stories, some of them are well known stories, like the story of 616 Squadron, who were the first to operate jets. This is known, but what I'm pulling to the fore is the fact that they were an auxiliary squadron and they were in origin part-timers, and their commanding officer was a former part-timer with another auxiliary squadron, 602, City of Glasgow. So, and he was a Battle of Britain ace as well. So it's really putting the Auxiliary Air Force front and centre of these incredible firsts, which the Royal Air Force is justly proud. But the part-timeness and the auxiliary nature of the squadron that made those achievements isn't always front and centre. So it's an effort to badge these achievements, if you will, as auxiliary achievements. So it's about 8 chapters, each with a different story, different focus, different squadron. So the first jets, and at the other end of the scale is the story of 613 City of Manchester Squadron, who attempted to help relieve the siege of Calais just before the Dunkirk evacuation. And they would dive bombing the German positions with a biplane Hawker Hectors, which they were more redolent of the First World War, these outdated aircraft. But how much that story is widely known, I've no idea, but it's a very minor episode, perhaps in the wider scheme of things, but an incredible, heroic episode, really, which deserved to be told.
And what will the book be called, and when is the anticipated release date?
Auxiliary Squadrons in Action, it's called, and it's slated to be out in April next year, but that's a TBC at the moment.
Okay, April 2026. Then look forward to
Yeah.
that. And where can the audience find out more details about these books and your works?
Probably the best places on Amazon. They're all available on there. The summaries of the books are on there. A little bit more about me. My biog is on there as well. So it's a good focus for not just to buy the books, of course, but as an information point where the three of them sit. Because my first book is from a different publisher to my current one and my next book. So, but on Amazon they all sit together.
Okay, well, link will be in the description below. Finally, last question I ask all interviewees. In terms of the body of work that you've done so far and ones that you hope to come, what ultimately would you like your legacy to be as a writer?
I think it would be predominantly that I've increased public understanding of the role of the Auxiliary Air Force and the Royal Auxiliary Air Force in RAF operations. Really, it's like I say, it's broadly an untold story in terms of putting that broad picture out there of squadrons like 614, but also the many distinctive achievements and just making the public more aware of it and more aware of the importance of reservist service because the world, as we know, is in an ever-changing precarious state at the moment, and reservists are going to play a bigger and bigger role, I believe, in whatever shape that conflict will come. Reservists give us a lot of flexibility and that knowledge of both the civilian and the military worlds, which I believe is a real asset. And I'd like the story of previous achievements of the auxiliaries and reservists to be more widely known.
Well, on that note, Martin Wade, thank you very much for your time. Good luck in
Thank
your future
you.
research and writings. And yeah, happy writing in the future. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Ewan. Cheers. Bye bye.